Impulsionar a mobilidade elétrica no Brasil. O caminho para promover a inovação tecnológica e mais qualidade de vida para as pessoas rumo ao desenvolvimento sustentável em nosso país. A mobilidade e o transporte trazem desafios econômicos, ambientais, sociais e tecnológicos que já são enfrentados em todo o mundo. Aqui no Brasil não é diferente. Precisamos elaborar e adotar políticas que façam frente aos nossos desafios, promovam nosso desenvolvimento e protejam nosso meio ambiente. A mobilidade elétrica contribui para tudo isso e aproveita muitas de nossas potencialidades. Contamos, afinal, com uma forte indústria, grande demanda para o transporte de pessoas e cargas e alta capacidade técnica e humana. Já são muitas as instituições que atuam para promover a mobilidade elétrica no Brasil. Uma estrutura que explore as sinergias entre suas iniciativas tem o poder de fazer com que alcancem seu objetivo comum de ter no país uma mobilidade elétrica alinhada com o desenvolvimento sustentável, econômica, ambiental, social e tecnologicamente. Foi com esse objetivo que, em 2020, unimos nossos esforços na Plataforma Nacional de Mobilidade Elétrica, a PNME. Nós, a PNME, somos mais de 30 instituições da indústria, do governo, da sociedade civil e da academia. Aqui representamos as visões e demandas dos diferentes setores da sociedade no que diz respeito à mobilidade elétrica. E trabalhamos não só para qualificar o debate sobre o tema, mas para propor soluções concretas que estejam alinhadas com as reais necessidades do Brasil. Compomos um conselho gestor da PNME, em que as demandas e temas dos membros são discutidos, priorizados e direcionados para a proposição de soluções para promover no Brasil uma mobilidade elétrica que equilibre da melhor forma possível aspectos políticos, tecnológicos e de mercado. Parta de projetos alinhados às nossas necessidades. Promova um ambiente continuamente propício à inovação. Mantemos, assim como os demais membros da PNME, nossa independência e agendas individuais, mas juntos temos acesso a um vasto repositório de conhecimento e articulação. Contamos com o aconselhamento técnico de uma comissão de ciência e tecnologia que reúne alguns dos melhores cérebros do Brasil em matéria de mobilidade elétrica. Criamos e apoiamos grupos de trabalho, juntamente com parceiros estratégicos que se debruçam e entregam soluções práticas, traduzindo nosso debate em resultados concretos com impacto direto na ponta.
Dentre os grupos de trabalho, destacam-se de formação profissional e de eletrificação de transporte público, que buscam soluções concretas para estes temas-chave rumo ao desenvolvimento da mobilidade elétrica no Brasil.
Finalmente, o Secretariado-Geral garante o bom funcionamento da PNME, gerenciando atividades-chave como comunicação, gestão do conhecimento e articulação entre os membros. Esse importante trabalho é realizado por entidades sem fins lucrativos que, embora neutras em relação ao debate, compartilham o interesse dos associados em promover a mobilidade elétrica no Brasil. A mobilidade elétrica é um elemento essencial para que o Brasil se desenvolva de maneira sustentável, ambiental, social, econômica e tecnologicamente. Ao promover a mobilidade elétrica, proporcionamos maior conexão entre as pessoas e promoção da qualidade de vida, melhoria nos serviços de transporte público e transporte de cargas, fomento da inovação, da troca de conhecimento e do avanço tecnológico, respeito ao meio ambiente e impulso ao uso de energias cada vez mais limpas. São grandes recompensas que exigem a superação de desafios igualmente grandes. Desafios que exigem trabalho conjunto e coordenado. Na PNME, reunimos esforços para que isso aconteça.
Senhoras e senhores, bom dia. Sejam todos bem-vindos e bem-vindas à primeira conferência da Plataforma Nacional de Mobilidade Elétrica. Eu sou Juliana Fredo, mestre de cerimônias digital desse painel, que conta com tradução simultânea. Para acessar o idioma desejado, basta selecionar a opção Interpretation na barra inferior da sua tela do Zoom. Antes de iniciarmos os painéis de hoje, gostaríamos de apresentar o cronograma desse terceiro dia de conferência PNME. O tema de hoje, no modo geral, será em torno do assunto Novos e Nossos Desafios. Os painéis acontecerão nos seguintes horários. Das 10 às 10h30, o painel com o tema A Mobilidade Elétrica no Sul Global. Das 10h30 às 11h30, Conectando Energia e Mobilidade. Quais as sinergias entre a mobilidade e o setor de energia? Das 11h30 às 12h10, meio-dia e 10, interação ao vivo via Zoom. Das 14 às 15, o painel com o tema Uma Mobilidade Elétrica Profissional. Caminhos para a formação profissional em mobilidade elétrica no Brasil. Das 15 às 16, Made in Brasil. Como novos caminhos para a indústria brasileira. Das 16 às 17, Green Recovery. E, por fim, das 17 às 17h40, novamente nós teremos a interação ao vivo via Zoom. Iniciaremos agora o terceiro dia da conferência PNME. A primeira conferência da Plataforma Nacional de Mobilidade Elétrica é um projeto que conta com o apoio da cooperação Brasil-Alemanha para o desenvolvimento sustentável, por meio da GIZ e do Instituto Clima e Sociedade, com a organização da Necta Conexões com Propósito. Iniciaremos, então, o primeiro painel de hoje com o tema A Mobilidade Elétrica no Sul Global. Eu convido agora a senhora Mônica Aradia, Transport Lead do Climate Champions, para sua apresentação.
Thank you so much for having me. I am really happy to be here because I am from Costa Rica. I spent time in Brazil in the past. I have many dear friends in your country, and I really think that what you are doing with this platform is transformational. So it's an honor to share some insight with you today. I have been working on climate and on decarbonization for many years, but where I found my space was in electric mobility, because it's a space where I was able to combine many parts of my professional life, many parts of my cultural life, and it's a space where I find a lot of opportunities for engaging many people. So before I get started, and I will tell you in a second how I am going to organize my presentation, I wanted to share with you an anecdote that really tells you something about what is happening when we engage with electric mobility. It's something that happened to me in Costa Rica. So about 3 years ago, in 2017, I was going to give a lecture in a big university about electric mobility. So that's 3 years ago. I was already driving electric, using electricity from renewables. I knew that that was something that my country would benefit from, but 3 years ago, it wasn't really embedded in the conversation. So before I went to the stage, an engineer, a professor from the university was there. We were talking about my presentation and the fact that I was just gonna go up. And he literally came to me and said that he was an engineer, that he knew a lot about electric mobility and that it didn't work and that batteries were not there yet. And he was literally telling me that whatever I was going to say on the stage, he disagreed with, because he didn't think that the technology was ready and he didn't think that it worked. And obviously, being Latin culture, I used some humor, and I told him, well, funny you say that, because I actually came from my home to the university driving electric. There is a mountain. I don't see any problems. But anyway, the reason why I'm telling you this is because that skeptical professor who needed to tell me that whatever I was going to say was wrong, he has now become a person who advocates electric mobility and is now lecturing around the country and going to programs. He drives electric. So it took him 3 years to go from a skeptical person to an advocate, and a very passionate one. So my point with this story is that you will see this a lot when you work in this space. You will see regulators who don't believe this, who will switch. You will see car dealers that don't want to sell electric cars or buses or trucks, and they will switch. You will see it also in the Congress sometimes with people who don't want to promote the laws that we need. So my point is, this is happening. And before before I get too excited with too many stories, let me tell you what I want to do in the minutes that I have. Because we have to talk about how to do this in the South, it's very important to also mention, before we jump into the South explicitly, it's very important to always start with the question of why we're doing this, whether it's in Brazil or Costa Rica or say Australia. Why is it that we have to do this? And the reason why we have to do this is it's getting bigger. You know, the reasons why we have to do this are not just climate and the alignment with the Paris Agreement and reducing emissions because we have to, but there are many other reasons that are adding urgency to this. And the reason why I want to mention that why is because the bigger the why, the bigger the coalitions we are going to have to build in order to go faster. And the reason why I'm a big believer in coalitions is because I have seen them working on the ground in many countries, in Costa Rica and in other countries, for example, in Chile. So number one is, when we think about why, that vision has to be big. In other words, if you are in Brazil and you're going to work on this is not about adding a few electric cars here and a few electric buses there. This is about transforming how we move people and how we move things. So the big vision, yes, is about reducing emissions, but it's about air quality, it's about health. It's also about industrial strategies for the 21st century. So your country is extremely important in that conversation because you have a very big industrial base. So this is not just about mobility or climate, it's about industrial strategy. And we need to bring people with industrial mindsets to this conversation because electrification is the future for the automobile industry. So the sooner they join, the better, because then they will have more time to adjust and to win. The other thing is that because so many things are happening in society, and you know this very well, there is a very strong case for justice. You know, when you really look at the numbers, a lot of the low-income neighborhoods are the ones that are being punished by the most offensive case of air pollution. So it's very important from the get-go to have those elements of social justice, climate justice in this conversation so that the agenda is not trivialized. It's very important to avoid the trivialization of electric mobility as a distraction or as a luxury, especially when you have these conversations in the South. It's very important to turn it around and say, we are doing this because it's good for people and is very good for vulnerable people in particular. We're talking about transforming trucks, transforming buses, transforming fleets. This is not a conversation about my personal car versus your personal car. It's a bigger conversation. So I hope that if you have encountered in your engagement on electric mobility people who have the stereotype that this is a luxury, think very carefully about how to tell the story from the perspective of the harm that we do to others if you don't do this. So those elements will be common in the North and the South, but I think they are very important in the South so that we move to the question of what. So why? Because we have very strong reasons, but what is it that we have to do? And that's where the story can get complicated and it can be convoluted. And my advice when we get into a conversation of what we have to do, my advice is that we keep it simple. It doesn't mean simplistic, but keeping things simple is critical to winning because at the end of the day, the solutions that we need from a technological perspective have been invented, unlike aviation or shipping, where you have still to go a long way to find a way of going from A to B with a zero emission airplane or going from A to B with a zero emission maritime solution. When it comes to road transportation, the solutions that we need are there. They are getting cheaper, they are getting better. So the point is that, yes, we will have to do a lot of things, but I really, really want to make the case that we need to get out of the storytelling that this is too complicated. It is not that complicated. So let's make sure we have a very clear story to tell about how we are going to do this. So number one, of course, we have to create markets. You have to have a very strong demand for this, and you have to have a strong supply. And what we have learned in other markets is that you break the chicken and egg question through a lot of demand activation strategies. So for example, what have we learned in Europe? I'm based in Amsterdam right now. We have learned that when the car companies were saying, we don't do this because we don't see demand, the activation that came from fleet owners, collectives of fleet owners saying, what do you mean there is no demand? I want to electrify all my fleets. In fact, I want to electrify them all by 2030. And that conglomeration of fleet owners, in the case of an initiative called EV100, means 4 million units, 4 million units that need to be electrified between now and 2030. So that allowed them to go to the manufacturers saying, what do you mean you don't see demand? What about us? So that activation is going to be very critical in the South, because we have to go where the demand activation is most ready and most willing to pay for the fleets, and that is corporate demand. We really have to look at the companies that have big fleets, and we have to make sure they are the ones that come first. In other words, don't put all the pressure on the buyers, even though obviously we need consumers to engage with this. When it comes to supply, it's very important to also connect that to public policy. In other words, you can get a lot done through market forces, because at the end of the day, there is an incentive to sell, and there is an incentive to buy, and an incentive to save money. But we can't get to where we need to just with market forces. We need public policy, proper public policy. And again, rather than get too convoluted here with stories of all the things we have to do with public policy, at the end of the day, after several years of learning lessons around the world, we know what we have to do from a policy perspective. We have to have, ideally, a law that incentivizes electric mobility for a while until we get price parity in the next 4 or 5 years. Ideally, you have to have EV mandates. You have to be able to say to companies, by this year, you need to produce a percentage of zero emission vehicles. By a following year or period, you need to produce more. So having these EV mandates will be very important. And you also have to have very easy ways of getting the infrastructure done. Getting infrastructure ready, being able to charge easily without complications is going to be very, very important. So how a country goes about that is critical. What is it that I see in the what category that is fascinating, and I also hope that you will be working on that, is the cultural side of this. You also need to be able to do the policy. You need to do the engagement with the market forces, with investors, and in addition to that, you also want to invest time in winning what we call the hearts and minds. And I would be actually quite curious to see how this is going in Brazil. My experience in Costa Rica is that once you start bringing people on board, once you start really spending time with strategies to explain people what it means, why it's beneficial, bring kids, bring doctors, bring, whoever wants to come. Once you create those strategies, this awareness, then the magic starts happening, because people start understanding that things will go faster if they engage. Before I get to the third block, which is more ideas of how to do this in practice, one thing that is missing in the North, and is probably missing in the South as well, is that we still need a long way to go with investors. We still need a long way to go with banks. Maybe in Brazil, the conversation is more advanced, but generally speaking, we have a lot of a lot of capital out there that is still very biased toward fossil fuel infrastructure. So one of the most urgent things we need to do, whether we are in Europe, the US, in Brazil, or Costa Rica, we need to have that conversation with the investor community and say, if you continue investing in fossil fuel infrastructure and fossil fuel-based transportation, that is a risk. It's a risk for you. It's a risk for society. What needs to happen for you to start coming on board? So one of the ways that I have found that makes a difference in Latin America, I have seen this in Chile, and I have seen it in Colombia, is the idea that you can bring investors toward a model where they buy the actual vehicles, say buses or trucks, and then they lease them to other companies. If you look at, for example, Chile has done something extremely important for the world. If you put aside China, which is a completely different topic because it's so big, if you look at the fact that outside China, Santiago de Chile has 455 buses in one fleet, is in a city, 455 as of last year, versus 600 buses in the entire US, then you have to ask the question of how that happened. How did that happen? How did a city in the South come to a place where you have more buses in one city than in the entire US? Well, the answer is finance and innovation. It was the private sector, it was a company basically buying the buses and leasing them to a bus operator. Clearly in 2020, when you tell the story, somebody could say, oh, well, that's pretty easy, that's pretty normal. Well, it wasn't at the time. It was an innovation. It was a very smart thing to do. And the same thing started happening in Colombia. Bancolombia, through Colombia Renting, or Renting Colombia, a company that leases cars, decided to acquire 1,000 trucks. And then once they had the model, then they go to Bimbo or they go to a beer company and they start saying, here's a business model. Let's see how it works, because you will save money, I will make money, and these fleets are zero emissions. So my point here is that even if you work on market, demand, supply, even if you work with policy, or even if you work with culture, and that is what you want to do, someone in the platform, somewhere in Brazil, will have to spend a lot of time, believe me, a lot of time engaging those investors, and that time will pay off because they will find very interesting propositions. So I actually think that there will be very good news. Before I move to the landing point, which is coalitions, and I really want to make sure I share some insights about the critical importance of broad coalitions, I also wanted to put on the table one idea that may sound a little painful and may sound a little, maybe some of you don't want to even hear the concept, but I am going to mention it because it's very important. Whether we, even if, let me say it the other way around, even if we're very positive about this and we say, this is going to be good for the climate, good for people, good for health, we are going to have a conversation about the fact that at some point we're going to have to put a deadline on when we're going to stop producing the most polluting cars, the ones that have an engine, the ones that require the gasoline or the petrol, and the ones that are going to go because they have exhaust pipes or tailpipes, as we call it in English. And that conversation is difficult because it is always very easy to resist it. But think about the fact that about 25 years ago, it was pretty normal to smoke in planes, right? You would be getting an airplane and everybody would be smoking, and that was normal. And at some point, society decided that it was not normal to go in a plane and smoke. And when that idea that you had to get rid of smoking in planes was put on the table, there was a lot of backlash and some people didn't want to do that. And to some degree, it's the same with tailpipes, right? Like the tailpipe that a car has is considered normal. But we know that with electric mobility, we're going to move to a paradigm with trucks, buses, taxis, vans, cars, motorbikes without tailpipes. So that means that at some point, we, as a society, are going to have to say, that's it, 2035, that's the end. And just to give you a happy piece of news, today, the UK announced that by 2030, they will no longer sell petrol and diesel cars. 2030, that's pretty amazing. So my point is, even if this conversation may not be the entry point in Brazil because of obvious reasons, because it's too controversial, it's important not to walk away from these difficult conversations. So keep it in mind that at some point when the time is right in the next years, that conversation will have to happen. And now let me land on the importance of the coalitions. Some of the most beautiful memories I have from the past 5 years are the work with what we call in the space EV associations, electric mobility associations. It's important to bring the voice of electric mobility advocates around a specific space where they exist in the public discussion. Why? Because often you will have this debate where you have only the experts, or somebody who's a regulator and somebody who sells cars. And this idea is that you will have, governments and industry collaborating, but or collaborating or disagreeing. But the point is, bring the users, bring the voice of the drivers, bring the voice of people who are already switching, and those advocates are going to be essential. You know why? Because there are so many myths out there. So the electric mobility associations have a very concrete function. They are the ones who are going to have to go to TV programs, to radio programs, to do festivals, to make sure that people start coming around this. And they are essential. In Costa Rica, for example, we pioneered the concept of electric mobility citizen festivals. And they have been a success. You do it on a Saturday, on a Saturday and a Sunday. People come with their families. And the concept there is that normal people, with a t-shirt that says, I drive electric, basically, they are the ones who explain from a family to another family, from a woman to another woman, or an older guy to another older guy. They start saying, this is what it's like to live without gasoline or diesel. I switched to electric. This is how I charge at home. One of the things we learned in the festivals is that they were very interesting for taxi drivers. They were skeptical, and then they were not. We have noticed also from the festivals that it takes about 12 months for people to switch. It takes about 12 months for a taxi driver to start changing a lot of the biases that you have when you have lived all your life with an internal combustion engine, and you're going to have a taxi that doesn't have it. Is pretty normal and pretty human to be a bit skeptical. So that is extremely, extremely important. The other thing that is also important for you to keep in mind in the coalitions is that, and I really want to make sure that this point is there for your discussions. When you build a coalition, let's make sure that they are broad. Let's make sure you have people who have very technical expertise and know what they are talking about. Infrastructure, energy grids, technologies for technology solutions. Obviously the justice element, frontline communities, people from climate backgrounds, people who love technology. Maybe they are not into climate. They don't have to be, but they love the technology. So broad coalition, but focus. If you are going to build a coalition around electric mobility, it's about electric mobility. It's not about the other topics. It's not about A, B, and C. It's about winning the law or winning a plan or winning a project in a city with buses. So there has to be this combination of broad, but disciplined and focused so that this coalition actually wins. And finally, and I just have one more minute, let me make a more philosophical point here, if you will. And this is something that I hope works in Brazil. I think I don't need to tell you that society is pretty divided out there. It's difficult, right? It's difficult to have certain conversations. And we're going to have to find topics that bring us together. And I am convinced that electric mobility is one of them. People love technology. People will love to be part of this. It's one of these opportunities that we have. We have seen it in the UK. We have seen it even in the US. It's starting to happen. People can come together around this. And I really wish that in the case of Brazil, a country that we all want to succeed, electric mobility is going to be one of these topics that will allow you to bring many people together, and it's going to allow you to win together. So all the best, and I look forward to hearing more about how this goes. Thank you, and good luck.
Thank you, Mônica. Senhoras e senhores, encerramos nesse momento o painel A Mobilidade Elétrica no Sul Global. Agradecemos a participação da senhora Mônica e de todos que nos acompanharam nesse painel. Convido todos a participarem dos próximos painéis da PNME. Para acompanhar a programação completa, clique em Programação e lá estarão disponíveis os temas, horários e palestrantes que participarão do evento. Agradeço mais uma vez a participação da senhora Mônica Aradia nesse painel. O link do próximo painel está disponível na página da programação. Nos vemos daqui a pouco. Tchau, tchau!